At night, Loch Ness becomes almost impossible to read. Roughly 230 meters deep, about 755 feet, it holds more fresh water than every lake in England and Wales combined. And the darkness is not caused by the night. Peat washed down from the surrounding hills stains the water so heavily that visibility can collapse within roughly 9 meters, about 30 feet. Even in full daylight, something could be moving beneath the surface, and you would have almost no way of seeing it. For centuries, people have claimed that something has. More than 1,000 documented encounters have been recorded across nearly 1,500 years. Farmers, scientists, pilots, police officers, even a former prime minister. Different people, different generations, describing a similar shape in the same dark water. And yet, after all those sightings, not a single piece of physical evidence has ever been recovered. The loch itself is surprisingly young. It formed around 10,000 years ago, carved by glaciers along a geological fault that is hundreds of millions of years older. Then there is the photograph that changed everything. For decades, the most famous image of the creature was treated as evidence of a monster beneath the surface. It was not. The photograph was constructed from a toy submarine, a piece of plastic wood, and a man's desire for revenge, and still, the image shaped the search for nearly 60 years. Then science looked directly into the water. In 2018, researchers collected hundreds of millions of genetic sequences from Loch Ness. They found no plesiosaur, no shark, no giant catfish, no sturgeon, but they did find something else in extraordinary quantities. And more recently, sonar has produced another problem. In 2024, and again in 2025, equipment detected something moving at depth. The manufacturer estimated that one of the contacts could have been comparable in size to the vessel above it. Whatever it was, nobody has been able to identify it. And one man has spent more than 3 decades trying. Steve Feltham abandoned his previous life in 1991 and began watching Loch Ness almost every day. After 24 consecutive years of searching, he reached a conclusion. It did not satisfy everyone. The loch remains dark. The sightings remain. The evidence does not yet agree with the legend. In this video, we're going into the evidence surrounding Loch Ness, separating what has been proven from what remains unexplained, and following the mystery wherever the evidence leads. If you're settling in for the night and enjoy stories where the evidence is stranger than the legend, a quick like and subscription helps us keep making them. And if you've ever found yourself wondering what might actually be beneath that dark water, tell me in the comments what first made you curious about Loch Ness. Now, let's go beneath the surface and examine where the story really begins. Loch Ness is shaped less like an ordinary lake than a long geological corridor stretched through the Scottish Highlands for 36.2 kilometers, about 22.5 miles from southwest to northeast. At its widest, it reaches 2.7 kilometers, about 1.7 miles, yet from any single shore, its full length is difficult to grasp. The water occupies a narrow trench enclosed by steep ground, and much of its character comes from the structure beneath it. The deepest confirmed point descends to 227 meters, about 744 feet, while the average depth is around 132 meters, about 433 feet. In places, the basin reaches depths greater than those found across large portions of the nearby North Sea. Its volume is approximately 7.5 cubic kilometers, about 2 trillion gallons, making it the largest freshwater body by volume in the British Isles. That depth has an ancient explanation. Loch Ness follows the Great Glen Fault, a vast fracture in Earth's crust formed roughly 400 million years ago during the Caledonian orogeny, when enormous land masses collided and reshaped northern Scotland. Much later, during the last ice age, glaciers found this weakened geological corridor and followed it through the highlands. Moving slowly under immense weight, the ice deepened and widened the existing fracture, carving the basin into the long trench that remains today. The loch itself is remarkably young by geological standards, forming about 10,000 years ago as the glaciers withdrew and meltwater gathered within the excavated valley. The retreating ice left behind a freshwater basin separated from the Atlantic, while the surrounding mountains preserved the shape of the ancient route. At depth, the water remains close to 5½ degrees Celsius, about 42 degrees Fahrenheit, through the year. Even when winter reaches the surrounding hills, the great body of deep water resists freezing. 6 rivers continually feed the loch, carrying dissolved peat from the surrounding landscape. That organic material gives the water its brown, tea-like appearance and absorbs light with unusual efficiency. Beyond roughly 9 meters, about 30 feet, visibility can collapse almost completely. Sunlight may be strong above the surface, yet only a small fraction penetrates into the water below. The result is an environment where depth cannot easily be judged by sight, and distant objects can become little more than shifting traces. The same material that colors the loch also changes the way every search through it must be conducted. The bottom preserves another record of time. Layers of radioactive material have settled into the sediment, including one associated with atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, and another marking fallout from the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. These deposits remain embedded in the mud like thin chronological signatures, recording events far beyond the shoreline and across the wider world. They provide scientists with markers that connect the present landscape to disturbances that occurred far from Scotland and remain preserved within the sediment. There is also a localized depression that some people have come to call Nessie's Lair, where depths have been reported reaching approximately 247 meters, about 812 feet. Sonar contacts have sometimes gathered around deeper portions of the basin, where the changing temperature and density of the water complicate the interpretation of echoes. Every feature belongs to the same system. The fault, the glacier, the rivers, the peat, the sediment, and the deep water are not separate details surrounding Loch Ness. Together they determine what can enter it, what can survive within it, and what can remain hidden beneath its surface. The story begins beside the River Ness, where the water leaving the Great Highland Basin travels north toward the sea. In the year 565, according to a later account, a small community had gathered beside the river for a burial. A man had died after entering the water, and those present attributed his death to a creature that had emerged from the depths. Among the travelers passing through this landscape was Saint Columba, an Irish missionary moving through territory controlled by the Picts. His encounter with the grieving group became part of the written life of the saint, preserved by the monk Adomnane in a work known as Vita Sancti Columbo. The book was completed before the year 704, more than a century after the event it describes. Adomnane's account gives the scene an unusual precision. Saint Columba approached the river and learned that the dead man had been swimming when a water creature attacked him. Another man was then sent into the river, apparently to cross toward the opposite bank. As he moved through the water, the creature surfaced beneath the attention of those watching from shore. It began moving toward the swimmer. St. Columba responded by raising his hand and commanding the creature to turn back. In the account, it obeyed. The animal withdrew beneath the surface, and the swimmer reached safety. Domnan presents the moment as an act of divine authority, with the creature itself becoming part of the demonstration of the saint's power. That purpose matters when the story is examined as historical evidence. Vita Sancti Columbae is a hagiography, a form of biography written to preserve and promote the holiness of a religious figure. Miracles, supernatural encounters, and moments in which threatening forces yield to sacred authority were familiar elements of this literary tradition. The account, therefore, cannot be treated like a modern field observation recorded by an independent witness standing beside the river. Adamnan was not present at the event, and his narrative was shaped by the religious purpose of the work, preserving the encounter as evidence of sanctity rather than testing the creature's identity or establishing its natural history. There is another detail that places a boundary around the legend. The creature was encountered in the River Ness, not within Loch Ness itself. The river forms the outlet from the loch and carries its water northward, but the two environments are not interchangeable. The event tells us that a story about a dangerous creature in Highland water existed in the 6th century. It does not establish that the same animal lived in the loch. Even so, the account has endured because it contains details that feel remarkably grounded within its own setting. There is a named place, a dead swimmer, a second person entering the water, witnesses gathered nearby, and an animal described as capable of killing a human being. The narrative does not simply mention a monster as an abstract spirit. It places a living creature into an ordinary landscape and gives it behavior, movement, and physical presence. For centuries afterward, the written record becomes much thinner. The story of Saint Columba remains suspended at the beginning of the tradition, preserved within a religious biography whose purpose was never to investigate the natural world. Its value lies partly in that tension. The account is neither a reliable zoological observation nor something that can simply be discarded as meaningless folklore. It is a 6th century record of what people believed had happened beside a highland river, carrying one of the oldest surviving descriptions of a water creature associated with the region. Long before the name Nessie entered newspapers, another image had already been carved into the stones of northern Scotland. The Picts left behind a visual language in which animals were rendered with enough recognizable detail that modern observers can still identify salmon, wolves, deer, birds of prey, and other creatures from their forms. Their artists were not simply filling stone with decoration, they were recording a world they knew. Among those familiar shapes appears something harder to place. Archaeologists call it the Pictish beast. Its body is broad, its tail narrows toward the end, and a curved neck extends forward from the body. Along its underside are shapes that have often been interpreted as flippers or limbs. It does not correspond neatly to any living Scottish animal. Its presence among recognizable animals makes the uncertainty especially enduring. The image occurs on several surviving Pictish stones, sometimes alongside unmistakable representations of animals from the surrounding landscape. That contrast gives the creature its particular importance. When an artist carved a deer, the result could be compared with an animal encountered regularly on land. When a salmon appeared, its identity belonged to a familiar part of the local environment. The Pictish beast occupies a different category, one that has resisted a straightforward zoological identification. Pictish society existed across northern Scotland during the early medieval period, with roots reaching considerably further into antiquity. Their carved stones were not illustrated field guides, and their symbols could carry meanings that are now inaccessible. An animal might represent a clan, a story, a supernatural being, a place, or an idea, rather than a creature personally observed by the person who carved it. That uncertainty has produced several interpretations of the beast. Some researchers have suggested that it could represent a water animal remembered from local experience. Others have proposed that the form is symbolic, perhaps combining features from different creatures or drawing upon older traditions shared across Northern Europe. The possibility of a mythological water spirit also remains open, especially because ancient cultures often gave unfamiliar or dangerous environments inhabitants of their own. Its resemblance to a long necked aquatic animal is therefore intriguing, but resemblance alone cannot establish identity. The carving contains no measurement, no written description, and no indication of the circumstances that inspired it. There is no surviving Pictish text explaining what the symbol meant. Even the apparent flippers may be artistic conventions whose original significance has been lost. What can be established is the age of the tradition. These carvings belong to a world that existed many centuries before the modern Loch Ness legend. The famous newspaper reports of the 20th century were separated from the Pictish stones by more than 1,000 years. The long-necked figure was already part of northern Scottish visual culture, while the people who carved it had their own languages, beliefs, political structures, and relationships with the landscape. That distinction matters because the Pictish beast does not prove that an unknown animal lived in Loch Ness. It does something more subtle. It shows that the idea of an unusual creature associated with the waters of northern Scotland cannot be traced solely to modern newspapers, photographs, or 20th century popular culture. The stone has no voice to tell us what its maker saw. It preserves only the shape chosen for the carving, surrounded by other symbols whose meanings are also partly lost. Yet that shape has survived the centuries, giving modern eyes a rare glimpse into how the people of ancient Scotland represented the living world around them, and the things that may have existed beyond the boundaries of what they could readily name. For more than 1,000 years after the account of Saint Columba, the written trail becomes remarkably thin. The waters of Loch Ness remain part of the Highland landscape, yet reports of unusual creatures are scattered across the centuries rather than gathered into a continuous tradition. The distinction is important because a legend can appear ancient when its surviving documentation is actually sparse. For generations, there was no single name gathering these observations together into one recognizable creature. Two accounts from the 19th century would later acquire importance, although neither received widespread attention at the time. In 1871, a man named Mackenzie reported seeing something resembling a log moving rapidly across the water. 17 years later, in 1888, a mason named Alexander MacDonald described a large, short-legged animal near the shore. Both observations were eventually published in 1934, after the modern monster story had already taken hold. Their delayed appearance makes them difficult to use, as independent evidence for a creature suddenly becoming visible in the 20th century. Then the landscape around the loch changed in a surprisingly ordinary way. A new road was completed along the northern shore in 1933, opening a route through the hills and woodland that gave motorists far more direct views across the water. The road did not create anything in the loch, but it changed who could see it. For the first time, large numbers of travelers could pass along the shoreline with an unobstructed view, carrying their own expectations and observations into the same landscape. On the morning of April 14th, John and Aldi Mackay were traveling along the newly completed road when Aldi noticed movement on the water. She described an animal with a whale-like appearance, rolling and plunging across the surface. The observation lasted long enough to become a local story, and the account reached Alex Campbell, a water bailiff and part-time journalist who lived in the area. Campbell submitted his report to the Inverness Courier. On May 2nd, the newspaper published the story under a headline that included a word capable of transforming an unusual observation into something much larger: monster. The article described what had been seen without providing a scientific identification, but the language gave the event a memorable shape. A creature in a Highland lake had become a public story. Newspapers in London soon picked up the account, and correspondents traveled north to investigate. The attention changed the scale of the phenomenon almost immediately. What had been a local report became a national curiosity, attracting journalists, visitors, hunters, and entrepreneurs. One circus even offered a reward of £20,000 for the capture of the creature, turning an uncertain animal report into something with a monetary value attached to it. As the months passed, the Inverness Courier received many more reports from around the region. The descriptions were far from uniform. Some witnesses spoke of a monster fish, others of a sea serpent, while others reached for the older language of dragons. Yet all of these descriptions were now being collected beneath the same developing story. The phrase Loch Ness Monster gradually became fixed in popular culture. By 1940, the creature had acquired the affectionate Scottish name Nessie, a small and almost playful word attached to an increasingly enormous legend. The transformation had taken place not through a single discovery, but through roads, newspapers, witnesses, and the growing habit of interpreting every strange movement on the water as part of the same story. The road changed more than the view. It changed the number of eyes looking toward the water, and with them, the number of fleeting shapes that could become stories. Before 1933, much of the northern shoreline was difficult to reach. Forest, steep ground, and the absence of a continuous road kept many travelers at a distance. Once the new route opened, motorists could move beside the loch with long stretches of unobstructed water visible from their cars. A landscape that had once been observed by relatively few local people was suddenly available to thousands of passing strangers, each carrying a different attention span, viewpoint, expectation, reason for stopping, and a different distance from shore. That change alone could increase the number of reported encounters without requiring any change beneath the surface. If an unusual movement appeared once in a while, more observers simply meant more chances for somebody to notice it. The mathematics of observation is uncomplicated. A rare event becomes less rare as the number of observers increases. Then the newspaper story entered the same landscape. Before the article appeared, an unfamiliar shape on the water had no established category called the Loch Ness Monster. Afterward, there was a name, a description, and an image forming in the public imagination. People arriving at the loch were no longer approaching an unknown body of water with completely open expectations. They had been given a template. Psychologists call this effect priming. When the mind encounters a category shortly before receiving uncertain sensory information, that category can become easier to recognize and more likely to influence interpretation. The effect does not require deception, exaggeration, or conscious invention. A person can sincerely report seeing a creature while describing an interpretation that formed within moments of seeing something ambiguous. The human visual system is especially dependent on this kind of interpretation. Light reaching the eyes provides incomplete information, particularly when distance, movement, reflections, and atmospheric conditions obscure the object being observed. The brain combines those fragments with previous knowledge and expectation, producing a coherent perception before every detail has been established. A dark shape crossing the surface might therefore begin as nothing more than an indistinct patch of movement. Once the idea of a monster is already present, the same patch can acquire a head, a body, a direction, and apparent purpose. The observer is not necessarily inventing those details deliberately. The brain is completing a pattern from incomplete information. This becomes especially important when several people witness the same event. One person's interpretation can influence another person's memory almost immediately. A group may begin with a vague observation, then discuss what each person believes was present, gradually producing a shared description that feels more certain because several people remember it. The surge of 1933 can therefore be understood without choosing between a physical event and a psychological one. More people were positioned along the shoreline, creating more opportunities to observe unusual movements. At the same time, the newspaper coverage supplied those observers with a powerful interpretive framework. Neither mechanism requires dishonesty. Neither requires every sighting to have the same cause. Some observations may have involved animals, drifting objects, wakes, or other natural events, while the expectations surrounding the new legend shaped how those events were perceived and remembered. What changed in 1933 was not necessarily the creature beneath the water, it was the relationship between the water and the people watching it. A road multiplied the observers, a newspaper supplied the category, and the human mind connected uncertain impressions to a story that was already waiting to receive them. By December 1933, the search for the creature had begun to attract people whose skills belonged more naturally to distant hunting grounds than to scientific investigation. Among them was Marmaduke Wetherell, a celebrated big game hunter whose reputation had been built on expeditions far from Scotland. The Daily Mail hired him to travel to Loch Ness and find physical evidence of the animal that newspapers had already transformed into a national sensation. Wetherell approached the assignment with confidence and theatrical energy. He searched the southern shoreline, examining the mud and vegetation for anything that might reveal the passage of a large creature. Then, within days of his arrival, he announced that he had found something extraordinary. Impressions in the mud appeared to form a trail leading from the water toward the undergrowth. The footprints seemed substantial enough to suggest an animal of considerable size. For a newspaper eager for evidence, they were exactly the kind of discovery that could turn a collection of sightings into something tangible. Plaster casts were made from the impressions and sent to London, where specialists at the Natural History Museum examined them. The answer came without the drama surrounding the discovery. The tracks had been made by a hippopotamus foot. The explanation was strangely ordinary. During that period, dried hippopotamus feet were sometimes used as decorative objects, including as umbrella stands in British homes. A person had apparently taken such a foot, pressed it into the wet ground, and used it to create a trail beside the loch. The impressions had been manufactured to resemble the footprints of an unknown animal. The precise identity of the person responsible was never conclusively established. What remained was the evidence itself, preserved in plaster and carrying a remarkably mundane explanation. The creature that seemed to have walked from the water had never possessed claws, scales, or an unknown anatomy. Its tracks had come from an object that had once belonged to an animal already familiar to science. For the Daily Mail, the embarrassment was considerable. The newspaper had sent an experienced hunter to Scotland in pursuit of a legendary creature, only to have his most promising discovery identified as the work of a decorative hippopotamus foot. Wetherell's reputation suffered with it, and he gradually withdrew from the public attention that had surrounded his expedition. Yet the incident did more than discredit one set of footprints. It introduced a new element into the developing history of the Loch Ness Monster, because the people involved were no longer simply observers trying to interpret uncertain movement on distant water. Someone had deliberately created evidence. That distinction changed the nature of the mystery. A mistaken sighting could arise from poor visibility, an unfamiliar animal, a drifting object, or the workings of human perception. A manufactured footprint belonged to another category entirely. It showed that the growing legend could become an opportunity for invention, especially when newspapers, public fascination, and the promise of recognition surrounded every new claim. Wetherell had been humiliated by the episode, but the story did not end with the dismissal of the footprints. The failure left behind something more personal than a damaged reputation. It created resentment toward the newspaper that had sent him there, and that resentment would soon become connected to another piece of supposed evidence. The mud had yielded no monster. Instead, it had revealed how easily an ordinary object could be transformed into a physical trace of something extraordinary. In the years that followed, that lesson would acquire a much more elaborate form, one designed not merely to leave footprints behind, but to place an image of the creature itself before the world. A photograph arrived at the Daily Mail in April 1934, carrying with it something more powerful than the image itself. It came with a name, Robert Kenneth Wilson, a London gynecologist whose medical profession gave the photograph an immediate aura of credibility. According to the account presented at the time, Wilson had been driving beside Loch Ness when he noticed a disturbance on the water and captured the scene with his camera. The resulting image was remarkably simple. A small head appeared above the surface, attached to what seemed to be a long, slender neck. The body remained hidden beneath the water, leaving only a dark shape rising against the open surface. To many viewers, the silhouette looked remarkably similar to the popular image of a plesiosaur, the long-necked marine reptile that had already become central to speculation about the creature. The photograph became known as the surgeon's photograph, and its influence came partly from the person attached to it. Wilson was not presented as a professional monster hunter or a newspaper entertainer. He was a surgeon, and that distinction mattered. The photograph therefore entered public discussion carrying an assumption that professional respectability made deliberate deception unlikely. For decades, the image became the visual identity of Nessie. It appeared in newspapers, books, magazines, and documentaries across the world. Researchers studying the possibility of a surviving prehistoric reptile repeatedly returned to it because the photograph seemed to offer something the eyewitness accounts could not provide: a physical image that could be examined long after the original sighting had ended. The picture remained influential for nearly 6 decades. Then, in 1994, a very different account emerged from an elderly model maker named Christian Sperling. At 93 years old, Sperling reportedly confessed that the creature had never been a living animal. According to his statement, he had constructed a small head and neck from plastic wood, attached the model to a toy submarine, and floated the assembly in the shallow water of Loch Ness. The story connected the deception directly to Marmaduke Wetherell, the hunter whose earlier footprint discovery had been exposed as a hoax. Wetherell had been humiliated by the Daily Mail, and the photograph was described as an act of revenge against the newspaper. Wilson, according to Sperling's confession, was brought into the arrangement because his professional reputation could provide the credibility the image needed. The model itself was tiny by the standards of the creature it supposedly represented. Its apparent monster measured only about 30 centimeters, roughly 12 inches, from the waterline to its highest visible point. Distance and framing concealed its scale, while the surrounding water provided no familiar object that could reveal how small the construction actually was. That detail became part of the photograph's enduring lesson. An image can preserve the appearance of something without preserving the scale, context, or circumstances that gave the appearance its meaning. For decades, viewers saw a creature because the photograph supplied a convincing silhouette, while almost everything necessary to judge the object independently had disappeared beyond the frame. Sperling's account is widely accepted, but the historical record is not completely free of disagreement. Some researchers have identified inconsistencies in the confession and have questioned whether every part of the traditional hoax narrative can be established with certainty. The photograph itself, however, has lost much of the authority once granted to it. Whatever uncertainty remains around the precise chain of events, the image can no longer stand as uncomplicated evidence of an unknown animal. Its power came from more than what appeared above the water. It came from reputation, timing, framing, and a story that gave a small manufactured object the scale of a legend. The photograph can be dismissed as a manufactured object, yet the people who reported seeing something in Loch Ness did not disappear with it. Their accounts remained in archives, notebooks, newspapers, and later collections, forming a record that stretches across generations and includes observations made before the famous image ever existed. Gary Campbell, who maintains the official Loch Ness Monster sightings register, has gathered more than 1,000 reports. The number alone is not the most interesting feature. Across decades, witnesses who had no apparent connection with one another repeatedly described a similar arrangement. A substantial body concealed beneath the surface, one or more humps rising above it, a narrow neck, and a comparatively small head. Movement was often described as smooth and deliberate, sometimes appearing to continue against the direction of the surface current. Such consistency does not prove that all of the witnesses saw the same animal. Human perception can converge on familiar shapes, especially when observers share a cultural story. Yet the persistence of similar physical descriptions remains part of the record, particularly when individual accounts were separated by years and made under different circumstances. The recurrence becomes more interesting when the witnesses differ in age, profession, location, and reason for being near the water. One of the more unusual reports came from Arthur Grant, a veterinary student traveling near the loch in January 1934. Around 1 in the morning, he nearly collided with something crossing the road. Grant later described and sketched the animal, producing a profile that resembled the long-necked form associated with the emerging monster legend. Importantly, he did not originally identify what he saw as a plesiosaur. The resemblance was an interpretation applied afterward to a shape he had already recorded. More than 2 decades later, another observer brought a different kind of evidence. Tim Dinsdale, an aeronautical engineer with a strong interest in the mystery, spent time watching the loch and eventually captured moving footage in 1960. The film showed an elongated object traveling across the water and later disappearing beneath it. The footage was subsequently examined by the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Center, a British intelligence organization specializing in aerial and photographic analysis. Its assessment was cautious. The object was considered probably animate, and its movement was estimated at approximately 16 kilometers per hour, about 10 miles per hour. The analysis did not identify the animal, and the film could not establish its size with certainty. What made the Dinsdale footage valuable was not that it revealed a monster clearly. It did not. Its importance came from preserving movement that could be examined after the event had passed. The object changed position altered its relationship to the surrounding water and eventually submerged, leaving investigators with a record rather than a memory alone. Accounts from 1933, 1934, 1960, 1985, and 2007 contain variations in detail, as any collection of human observations would. Yet certain elements recur often enough to remain notable. A body mostly hidden beneath the surface, raised portions moving in sequence, and a small elevated form at the front. Even when individual descriptions diverge, the broad silhouette has remained surprisingly recognizable across generations. The mystery, therefore, survives in an unusual state. Its most famous photograph has largely collapsed as evidence, while hundreds of less celebrated observations continue to occupy the record. Some may reflect animals, objects, waves, or perception. Others remain difficult to classify. The value of these accounts lies not in their ability to prove a creature exists, but in the persistent gap between what witnesses say they encountered and what investigators can confidently identify. That gap remains part of the historical record, preserved each time an observation resists a simple name. By October 1987, the search had entered an age in which human eyes were no longer the only observers. Adrian Shine, a naturalist who had spent years studying the loch and was skeptical of the monster interpretation, helped organize an operation built around a different kind of vision. Instead of waiting for something to appear at the surface, the investigators would send sound through the water and listen for whatever returned. Operation Deep Scan brought 24 boats together in a coordinated survey. Each carried echo sounder sonar equipment, allowing the vessels to examine the water beneath them as they advanced. Arranged across the loch, the boats formed a moving line that extended from shore toward shore. As the formation progressed along the basin, each vessel contributed another narrow section of information, creating what investigators described as a sonar curtain. The scale of the undertaking mattered. The formation moved through the loch over several days, covering its full length of 36.2 kilometers, about 22.5 miles. Every passing signal had to be interpreted through the changing depth, temperature, and density of the water. Sonar does not produce a photograph. It produces echoes, and an echo becomes meaningful only when its timing, strength, shape, and movement are considered together. Most of the returns encountered during the survey could be treated as ordinary features of the underwater environment. Then three contacts stood apart. They appeared at depths between 180 meters, about 590 feet, and 201 meters, about 660 feet. The operators considered them substantial enough to warrant attention, particularly because they appeared within a region influenced by the loch's thermal boundary. That boundary separates water layers with different temperatures and densities. Sound traveling through such layers does not always behave in a simple straight path. Changes in the physical properties of the water can alter the way an acoustic signal travels, producing returns whose origins are not immediately obvious. Yet the three deep scan contacts were not simply discarded as technical noise. The operators could not assign them to a known species. They were not accompanied by photographs, recovered remains, or any other physical evidence that could establish what had produced the echoes. The contacts, therefore, occupied an unusual middle ground. They were real signals recorded by instruments, but their source remained uncertain. Adrian Shine did not interpret that uncertainty as proof of a monster. His skepticism remained intact, and he regarded misidentification as the more plausible explanation for the broader legend. Still, he acknowledged that unexplained sonar returns were genuine unresolved observations. The distinction was important. Skepticism did not require pretending that every unexplained signal had already been identified. The data also received attention from Lowrance, the company that manufactured the sonar equipment. Its review found that the contacts were consistent with a large living object, while stopping short of identifying any particular animal. That conclusion did not transform the echoes into biological evidence. It simply preserved the possibility that something substantial had produced them. For the first time, the legend had been placed inside a disciplined survey whose observations could be revisited, compared, and measured. The mystery had entered the language of instruments, but measurement had not yet produced an answer. Operation Deep Scan, therefore, produced neither the discovery its organizers might have hoped for, nor the definitive absence that skeptics might have preferred. It demonstrated that the loch could be searched systematically, and that modern instruments could detect unexpected returns at considerable depth. Yet the technology had reached its own boundary. Sound could reveal an object without revealing its identity, and a signal without a body could leave the central mystery untouched. There is a particular difficulty in looking for anything beneath Loch Ness. The water does not simply conceal what lies within it. Its physical properties interfere with the tools designed to reveal that hidden world, turning observation into a problem of light, depth, temperature, movement, and distance. The peat carried into the loch darkens the water so thoroughly that sunlight disappears rapidly below the surface. At roughly 9 meters, about 30 feet, ordinary visibility has already become extremely poor. Farther down, cameras and lights struggle to produce useful images because illuminated particles scatter the available light while the surrounding water absorbs it. Divers have reported seeing only a few inches beyond their masks, reducing the underwater landscape to whatever their hands can reach. Depth adds another limitation. The deepest confirmed part of the loch reaches about 227 meters, about 744 feet, placing much of the basin beyond the practical reach of ordinary diving equipment. Specialized vehicles can descend farther, but every additional meter increases the demands placed on pressure housings, cables, lighting systems, propulsion, and communication. Searching a large volume at such depths is therefore not simply a matter of sending an instrument downward. Temperature creates another boundary that cannot be seen from above. The upper water and deeper water differ in density, with a transition known as the thermocline separating them. In parts of the loch, this boundary occurs around 46 meters, about 150 feet, below the surface. Sound traveling through water can change direction as it encounters layers with different temperatures and densities. An echo may therefore arrive from an unexpected path, while a genuine object can become harder to distinguish from the surrounding acoustic background. The water itself is also capable of moving in ways that are difficult to infer from the surface. Internal seiches are broad underwater waves produced when changes in wind pressure push the water mass from one end of the basin toward the other. These oscillations can travel along the entire loch, which extends for about 36 kilometers, about 22½ miles, and may continue through cycles lasting roughly 30 to 56 hours. As the deeper layers shift, the thermocline rises and falls, producing counter currents that can carry submerged material in directions very different from the movement visible above. Even a vessel equipped with sonar cannot simply sweep the entire volume at once. The loch covers approximately 56 square kilometers, about 22 square miles, and its depth changes continuously across the basin. A survey can examine a corridor, then another, but gaps in position, depth, timing, and acoustic coverage remain possible. An animal moving outside the effective detection zone could pass through without producing a useful return, while natural structures or changing water layers might create signals that resemble something alive. For investigators, the challenge is therefore not a single obstacle, but a layered environment in which several forms of uncertainty operate together. A target may be too deep for an optical system, too obscured for a camera, too close to a changing thermal boundary for an uncomplicated sonar return, or simply outside the portion of the basin being examined at that moment. The loch does not need to hide an animal deliberately. Its own physics already provides concealment. All these conditions overlap. Darkness limits cameras, pressure limits access, stratification complicates sound. Internal movement shifts the environment beneath the surface, and the sheer volume of water makes complete observation extraordinarily difficult. None of this provides evidence for an unknown animal. It does, however, explain why the absence of a clear image has never been equivalent to proof that nothing unusual could occupy the deeper parts of the loch. A strange thing about moving water is that its deepest motions can contradict everything visible above it. On Loch Ness, wind may push the surface in one direction, while a much larger movement unfolds below, carried by a hidden oscillation known as an internal seiche. The phenomenon gives the loch another kind of motion, one capable of carrying floating material in ways that can appear surprisingly deliberate. A seiche is essentially a standing wave within a confined body of water. Pressure from changing winds can pile water toward one end of a basin, then allow it to shift back, creating a long, rhythmic oscillation. At the surface, this movement can sometimes be noticed as a gradual rise and fall of the water level between opposite ends of the loch. Beneath the thermocline, however, the same disturbance can travel through the boundary, separating warmer upper water from colder, denser water below. That boundary can tilt, roll, and recover, producing currents that are difficult to detect from the surface. Those currents matter because Loch Ness receives more than water from the surrounding landscape. 6 rivers entering the basin also carry branches, roots, and timber into it, especially during periods of stronger runoff. Some pieces eventually become waterlogged while retaining enough trapped air to remain partly buoyant. Their position in the water can change with pressure, temperature, and the movement of surrounding layers. When an internal current catches one of these partly buoyant logs, the result can be surprisingly deceptive. The timber may drift or slide beneath the surface, while the current carries it in a direction opposite to the movement suggested by wind or surface flow. From a distant shoreline, the visible portion may appear as several rounded humps following one another. The exposed shape rises and falls smoothly, without the irregular splashing expected from ordinary debris. As the current changes, the object can alter direction or disappear beneath the surface with little warning. Distance adds another layer to the illusion. A partially submerged log seen across a broad stretch of dark water has no obvious scale. Its visible contours can merge into a single elongated form, while gaps between sections create the impression of separate humps belonging to one body. Reflections and changing illumination can soften the edges further. Human perception then supplies continuity, joining fragments into a coherent animal shape. This mechanism becomes especially interesting when older sightings are compared with weather records and known patterns of water movement. Researchers associated with the Loch Ness project have examined conditions under which internal seiches become active, finding that some reported movements resemble what floating timber could produce during these events. The correspondence does not establish that every witness saw a log, but it provides a physical process capable of reproducing several recurring features of the reports. The idea has also been tested rather than left as an attractive explanation. Logs moved through the loch under controlled conditions have produced silhouettes photographed from distances comparable to those faced by observers on shore. When images were shown to people without identifying the objects beforehand, some observers interpreted the shapes as living animals. That result matters because it separates the phenomenon from imagination alone. Something ordinary can generate an image that appears biologically organized when viewed under the right conditions. An internal seiche cannot account for every sighting, and it cannot prove that every unexplained contact was debris. What it offers is more subtle. It demonstrates that the loch possesses its own hidden machinery for moving objects, shaping silhouettes, and reversing apparent direction. A body of water can create the appearance of intention without anything beneath it possessing intention at all. From the moment the surgeon's photograph was published in 1934, one word came to dominate the public imagination: plesiosaur. The resemblance was understandable. Some long-necked plesiosaurs possessed a silhouette of broad body, extended neck, and small head that could, at a distance, resemble the famous image. Yet the resemblance becomes much less convincing when the animal is placed inside the actual history and ecology of Loch Ness. Plesiosaurs were marine reptiles that lived from roughly 215 million years ago until 66 million years ago. They survived for an immense span of geological time, diversifying into many forms before disappearing during the mass extinction that also ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. Their bodies were adapted to an ancient marine world, with four powerful flippers and streamlined shapes suited to propulsion through open water. Some had short necks, while others carried extraordinarily long ones, creating the familiar outline that later became attached to Nessie. The first difficulty is chronology. Loch Ness formed only about 10,000 years ago, after glaciers retreated from the highland valleys. Plesiosaurs had already been absent from the planet for about 65 million years. There was therefore no ancient lake waiting for one to inhabit it. The proposed animal would have needed to survive an extinction event, persist for millions of years afterward, and somehow enter a freshwater basin that did not yet exist. The sequence requires several extraordinary exceptions before the creature even reaches Scotland. Breathing creates another problem. Plesiosaurs were air-breathing reptiles, and a population living within the loch would have needed regular access to the surface. A single animal might occasionally escape observation, but a breeding population would repeatedly expose itself as individuals surfaced, rested, fed, and cared for young, leaving many opportunities for observers along the shoreline and for researchers conducting repeated surveys. Across generations, those appearances would create opportunities for clear photographs, carcasses, or physical remains. Temperature presents an additional constraint. Loch Ness remains around 5½ degrees Celsius, about 42 degrees Fahrenheit, in its deeper water. Plesiosaurs were ectothermic, meaning their body temperature depended substantially on the surrounding environment. Their physiology was adapted to ancient marine conditions, and there is no evidence that a large plesiosaur lineage could maintain a viable population in a cold Scottish freshwater system. Then there is food. Loch Ness is oligotrophic, meaning that nutrients are relatively scarce and biological productivity is limited. A reptile weighing several tons would require a substantial and dependable energy supply. Supporting one large animal would already place demands on the ecosystem, while sustaining a breeding population would require enough prey to feed adults and growing young year after year. The available biomass does not comfortably fit that requirement. Population biology makes the proposal still harder to sustain. One surviving animal cannot reproduce indefinitely. A viable lineage requires multiple individuals, genetic diversity, successful breeding, and enough young surviving to adulthood. Even a small population would leave biological traces over time. Bones, carcasses, damaged remains, or other physical evidence would be expected somewhere within the loch or along its shores. Paleontologist Nick Longrich of the University of Bath, who co-authored a 2022 study confirming that some plesiosaurs were capable of living in fresh water, has addressed the Nessie connection directly. Freshwater tolerance cannot bridge the biological gap between ancient oceans and Scotland. The problem is not one missing permission in nature. It is the accumulation of chronology, physiology, ecology, and population biology, each narrowing the path until the familiar plesiosaur explanation becomes extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Once the plesiosaur has been removed from the list, the remaining possibilities become much more ordinary and, in some ways, more interesting. The loch is not isolated from the wider ecosystem of northern Scotland. Fish, birds, mammals, and drifting organisms can all enter its waters, while occasional visitors from the sea can travel inland through the River Ness. Each candidate carries a different biological story, and each can be tested against what the loch actually contains. The Greenland shark seems suited to the colder possibilities. It inhabits deep northern waters and can reach more than 7 meters, about 23 feet in length. Individual sharks have also been recorded entering freshwater environments. Its size and ability to live in darkness make it an attractive theoretical match for a large unidentified animal beneath the surface. Yet the environmental DNA survey, conducted in 2018, found no Greenland shark DNA among the samples collected throughout the loch. The animal remains biologically imaginable, but there is no genetic trace supporting its presence there. Atlantic sturgeon offers a different possibility. These ancient-looking fish can grow beyond 3 meters, about 10 feet, and their ridged backs can break the surface in a sequence of raised shapes. Historical records also show that sturgeons have entered Scottish rivers from the sea. Their body form could produce an unfamiliar silhouette for someone watching from a distant shore. Even so, the environmental DNA results found no evidence of sturgeon in the loch, removing another large fish from the strongest biological candidates. The European catfish has the dimensions to make an even more convincing silhouette. Some individuals can exceed 4 meters, about 13 feet, and exceptional specimens have reached weights of more than 127 kilograms, about 280 pounds. A large catfish moving near the surface could create a long, uneven profile, especially when only portions of its body were visible. Yet once again, the genetic survey found no catfish DNA. A species capable of producing the shape is not necessarily a species living in the water. Seals introduce a different kind of possibility because they are already known visitors. Gray seals have entered the lower reaches of the River Ness, and a seal swimming with only parts of its body exposed can create a remarkably unfamiliar outline. The resemblance becomes especially interesting when an animal surfaces, dives, and reappears at another point. But a seal entering fresh water remains a transient event rather than evidence of a resident population, and the environmental DNA survey did not detect seal DNA in its Loch Ness samples. Then there is the basking shark, a creature capable of reaching about 12 meters, about 40 feet, and one that has contributed to several historical monster stories. A decomposing basking shark can lose the familiar proportions of a living animal with exposed internal structures, creating the appearance of a long neck, head, and bulky body. Several supposed monster carcasses have eventually been identified as decomposed sharks. This explanation can account for particular incidents, but it cannot establish a permanent animal living in the loch. The environmental DNA results leave one major candidate standing apart from the others: the European eel. Eel DNA was abundant across the sampled waters, appearing at nearly every location examined. The survey could not determine the size of individual eels, so it could not establish the existence of giant specimens. It simply showed that eels are widespread throughout the loch. Among the large animal explanations tested, that distinction matters. The mystery had not produced a monster in the genetic record. It had produced something much more familiar and potentially much more revealing. By the spring of 2018, the mystery had become something that could be sampled, filtered, cataloged, and compared beneath the surface of the loch. Professor Neil Gemmell of the University of Otago in New Zealand arrived with an international team carrying equipment designed for a very different kind of search. Instead of looking for a shape moving through the water, they would look for traces left behind by everything that lived there. Every organism constantly sheds fragments of genetic material into its surroundings. Skin cells, scales, mucus, waste, and other biological particles enter the water carrying molecular signatures that can persist long enough to be collected. Scientists call this environmental deoxyribonucleic acid. It does not require an animal to be captured, photographed, or even seen. A small volume of water can contain a record of life that passed through it. Across Loch Ness, the team gathered 250 water samples from different depths and locations, including surface water, mid-water layers, and areas approaching the deepest parts of the basin. Each sample was passed through fine membranes capable of trapping biological material. Back in the laboratory, those fragments could be separated, sequenced, and compared with genetic databases containing information from known organisms around the world. The resulting collection contained hundreds of millions of genetic sequences, creating an unusually detailed biological inventory of the loch. Fish appeared throughout the samples, along with birds, mammals, microscopic organisms, and countless other forms of life. The genetic record was not empty or incomplete. It was rich enough to reveal a complicated freshwater ecosystem, including species that might never have been noticed during an ordinary visual survey. In this sense, the survey transformed the loch into a biological archive where even unseen encounters could leave traces behind. Then came the absences. There were no reptilian sequences that could support a surviving plesiosaur. Nothing pointed toward a Greenland shark, an Atlantic sturgeon, or a giant catfish. Most importantly, the survey produced no genetic signature belonging to some large, previously unknown vertebrate. If an enormous animal had been living continuously in the loch and shedding biological material into the water, its absence from such an extensive collection would be difficult to explain. Gemmell was particularly direct about the ancient reptile theory. The samples contained no evidence of reptilian sequences consistent with a plesiosaur, making the existence of a giant, scaly reptile in Loch Ness extraordinarily unlikely. The result did not depend on interpreting a photograph or judging the testimony of a witness. It came from the water itself, examined at a molecular level. Yet one familiar creature refused to disappear from the investigation. Eel genetic material was found in remarkable abundance, appearing across almost every sampled location and depth. The survey could establish that eels were widespread throughout Loch Ness, but it could not determine the size of the individual animals that produced those genetic traces. Environmental deoxyribonucleic acid records presence far better than body dimensions. A small eel and an unusually large eel can leave genetic material belonging to the same species. That limitation left a narrow opening in the evidence. Gemmell did not claim that giant eels had been discovered, and the survey offered no measurement proving that such animals existed. Instead, the concentration and distribution of eel material meant that the possibility could not be completely dismissed. After decades of photographs, sonar contacts, footprints, and eyewitness accounts, the search had reached an unusual place. The water had ruled out several dramatic possibilities, while leaving behind one ordinary animal whose unknown size allowed the old story to continue in a much more biological form. There is something unusually ancient about the European eel, not because it belongs to a forgotten age, but because scientists spent centuries watching it without understanding where it came from. The European eel is Anguilla anguilla, a fish whose life begins thousands of miles from the rivers and lakes where much of its growth takes place. Its journey crosses an ocean, follows invisible currents, and eventually leads some individuals into waters far inland. The story begins in the Sargasso Sea, a broad region of the Atlantic Ocean defined by circulating currents rather than a coastline. It lies roughly 2,400 kilometers, about 1,500 miles, east of Florida. There, adult eels are believed to spawn before dying, releasing eggs that hatch into transparent larvae shaped almost nothing like the familiar fish they will become. Those larvae enter the Atlantic circulation and drift toward Europe, carried partly by the Gulf Stream. Their passage can cover between 4,800 and 6,400 kilometers, about 3,000 to 4,000 miles, before they reach continental and island coastlines. Along the way, their bodies change. The flattened larvae become young eels known as glass eels, their bodies nearly transparent as they approach river mouths. From there, instinct and water chemistry guide them inland. Some travel through estuaries and rivers for hundreds of kilometers, about hundreds of miles, entering lakes, wetlands, and narrow waterways far removed from the sea. European eels can also move across damp ground when conditions permit, using their skin to absorb oxygen from moist surfaces. This allows them to cross short stretches of land and reach waters that seem disconnected from any obvious migration route. Once established in fresh water, an eel can remain for many years, feeding and growing before beginning the transformation that sends it back toward the ocean. Some individuals may spend decades in their inland habitat. Their bodies become larger and darker, preparing for a final migration toward the breeding grounds, where the cycle began, a journey that completes a life history still being studied. That life history makes the eel an unusual candidate within the Loch Ness mystery. It is already capable of entering environments that seem difficult for an oceanic animal to reach, and its migrations blur the boundary between sea and inland water. Conger eels, close relatives of European eels, belong to the Atlantic marine environment and can grow beyond 3 meters, about 10 feet, in length. Their size shows that eel-shaped bodies can become remarkably large, although conger eels are marine animals. In 2001, 2 conger eels, measuring roughly 2 meters, about 7 feet, each were found on the shore of Loch Ness. There was no evidence that they had lived and grown inside the loch, and their marine biology made a local life history unlikely. The environmental deoxyribonucleic acid survey adds an important limitation, especially when size is the feature that matters most. Genetic traces can identify an eel without revealing its length, age, or weight. A small eel and a very large eel of the same species can leave essentially the same genetic signature in the surrounding water. The abundance of eel material therefore establishes that eels are widespread, but it cannot turn those traces into a ruler. That distinction leaves the giant eel hypothesis in an unusual scientific space. There is no confirmed giant eel from Loch Ness, yet there is also no genetic measurement capable of proving that every eel there is small. Presence is measurable. Extraordinary size remains unmeasured. Its life cycle is unusual enough to make the candidate scientifically interesting, even without proving anything extraordinary at all. From the shoreline, the giant eel hypothesis becomes less abstract when its shape is allowed to exist in the water. Imagine the surface before sunrise, darkened by peat and broken only by the faint disturbance of something moving beneath it. A large eel would not travel like a rigid animal. Its body would pass through a continuous series of muscular waves, each movement beginning near the head and traveling toward the tail. Only part of that long body would need to approach the surface at any one moment. Seen from a distance, the effect could be strangely familiar. The back might rise, disappear, then rise again farther along its path, creating several rounded humps that seem connected beneath the water. Because the body is flexible, those humps would not appear as separate objects. They would form and vanish in sequence as the animal advanced. In peat-stained water, where contrast is already reduced, the eye could compress those movements into a single creature with a long body beneath the surface. The head creates another important detail. An eel investigating the surface can raise its front portion while the rest of the body remains submerged. Held at roughly a 45-degree angle, that narrow head and upper body could produce a silhouette resembling the long neck and small head repeatedly described in accounts of the loch. The resemblance would not require the animal to possess anything like a reptilian neck. It would emerge from posture, distance, and the limited portion of the body visible above the water. An eel also moves through the water in a way that can make disappearance seem unusually abrupt. Its body is negatively buoyant, meaning it does not simply remain at the surface when its forward motion stops. Swimming provides the movement needed to maintain its position, and when that motion changes, the animal can descend beneath the surface. A large eel could therefore vanish without the kind of dramatic splash expected from a heavy animal falling into deep water. This physical behavior matters because many traditional descriptions contain the same basic sequence. Something appears, moves with an apparently deliberate rhythm, presents several raised sections, and then slips beneath the surface. The animal would not need to perform any extraordinary maneuver. Ordinary eel locomotion, viewed from far enough away, could create an extraordinary impression. There is even a modern observation from the River Ness, the waterway connecting the loch with the sea. In September 2019, the Ness Fishery Board released footage showing a long, sinuous shape moving through the river. The footage did not establish that the animal was unusually large, and it did not prove a connection to the monster reports. What it demonstrated was simpler and more useful. Eel-shaped forms can occur in the same waterways associated with the legend, where cameras and observers may encounter them without knowing their identity at first glance. The possibility also avoids one of the larger problems facing a prehistoric monster. A single eel does not need a permanent breeding population inside the loch to account for occasional observations. European eels are migratory animals capable of moving between marine and freshwater environments. An individual entering the loch could remain for years, grow, and eventually leave or die there. If it died in the deep basin, its body would descend beyond the reach of ordinary observation, leaving no skeleton on the shoreline. That does not make the giant eel theory proven. It simply gives the sightings record a living animal whose anatomy, movement, migration, and behavior can reproduce several of the visual details that once seemed to demand something far more extraordinary. Some mornings on Loch Ness seem to rearrange the boundary between water and air. When the surface remains relatively warm while colder air settles above it, differences in temperature can bend light as it travels through the atmosphere. This atmospheric refraction can produce superior mirages, stretching distant objects vertically and distorting their proportions. A boat far across the loch may appear taller than it really is, with its hull elongated above the surface and its lower structure hidden by distance. Under the right conditions, an ordinary vessel can acquire the outline of something entirely unfamiliar. The water itself can create another layer of confusion. A passing boat sends waves outward, and within a long, enclosed basin, those waves can meet steep shorelines and return across the surface. Reflected wakes may overlap with incoming waves, producing ridges and patterns that persist after the original vessel has moved away. To an observer watching from shore, the disturbance can seem to travel independently, especially when several wave systems intersect. The apparent movement belongs to the water, not to a creature beneath it. Reflections from changing light can further soften the boundary, making a raised ridge appear detached from the surface around it. For a watcher with no nearby scale reference, distance becomes part of the illusion itself. Timber adds another possibility. Loch Ness receives branches, roots, and logs from surrounding waterways, and some pieces can become saturated enough to hover near neutral buoyancy. Changes in water movement, temperature, or pressure can alter that balance. A partially submerged log may rise, drift for a time, and then sink again, leaving only a brief sequence of visible shapes. When the exposed portion appears in stages, the eye can connect separate moments into one continuous animal. Even living animals can create silhouettes that seem larger and stranger than their true forms. European otters sometimes travel in groups, following closely behind one another. From a distance, a line of swimming bodies can resemble a chain of rounded humps, each appearing and disappearing as the animals move through the surface. Their actual size is modest, but perspective removes the scale cues that would normally reveal that fact. Red deer provide an even more unusual illusion. They are capable swimmers and can cross substantial stretches of water. Viewed from ahead, a swimming deer exposes only its head and upper neck, while the rest of its body remains submerged. The resulting profile can contain two features deeply familiar from monster reports: a narrow head and a raised neck emerging from an otherwise uninterrupted surface. Birds can add movement to the picture as well. A cormorant repeatedly diving in poor visibility may appear for only a moment before disappearing again. From several hundred meters, about 300 yards, those brief contacts can form a rhythm of separate humps advancing across the water. Without a clear reference for scale, the observer may naturally join them into a single moving form. None of these effects requires a fabricated story or an extraordinary animal. They arise from ordinary physics, animal behavior, floating debris, and the peculiar geometry of a long freshwater basin. The important detail is that each effect can alter not only what is seen, but also the apparent size, direction, continuity, and distance of what is seen. Loch Ness, therefore, does something unusual to observation itself. It provides a setting where light can stretch an object, waves can move without an obvious source, timber can appear and disappear, and familiar animals can lose their recognizable proportions. In such a landscape, the difference between seeing something and correctly identifying it can become remarkably wide. Long before a sighting becomes a story, the human brain has already begun making decisions about what the eyes receive. Vision is not a simple recording process. It is an active construction, assembling incomplete signals into a usable picture of the world. In daylight, familiar shapes provide abundant information. On dark water, that information can collapse into fragments, and the mind must work with what remains. One of the tendencies involved is apophenia, the perception of meaningful patterns within ambiguous or unrelated information. It is the same broad capacity that allows a face to appear in the grain of wood or a recognizable figure to emerge from shifting textures. This ability is useful because the brain is constantly searching for structure. Yet when visibility becomes poor, the same system can produce interpretations that extend beyond what the senses actually established. Loch Ness creates an unusually fertile setting for this process. A distant shape may reveal only a small portion of itself. A wave can conceal its origin. A bird can vanish beneath the surface between two observations. A piece of timber can present one outline while drifting and another when it turns. The observer receives separate fragments, often without enough information to determine their scale or identity. Rather than leaving those fragments disconnected, the brain tends to assemble them into the most plausible pattern available. Expectation becomes especially important. A person arriving at Loch Ness already knows that the landscape carries a famous legend. The possibility of seeing something unusual is therefore present before any unusual shape appears. A study published in 2001 found that people shown imagery associated with Nessie before viewing ambiguous underwater footage were more likely to report seeing a creature than people who viewed the same footage without that prior suggestion. The physical stimulus had not changed, the interpretation had. Memory can extend the process long after the original observation has ended. Research by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus and other memory scientists has shown that recollection is reconstructive rather than a perfect replay of an earlier event. Each time a memory is recalled, surrounding information can influence how that memory is represented afterward. Someone who notices a dark shape on the loch and later encounters a detailed account of a monster may gradually remember the original event with features that were never clearly observed. This does not require dishonesty. The altered memory can feel completely authentic to the person carrying it. The effect becomes stronger when many uncertain observations accumulate within the same cultural setting. More than 1,000 reported sightings create an enormous archive of human experience, but the number alone cannot establish what produced them. Each account is shaped by weather, distance, visibility, expectation, memory, and the particular moment in which an observation occurred. Some witnesses may have seen animals, others may have seen boats, waves, floating timber, or changing light. Still, others may have encountered something that remains difficult to identify. What emerges is not a simple division between truthful witnesses and mistaken ones. It is something more interesting. Human perception can transform incomplete physical information into a coherent experience before conscious reasoning has time to examine every detail. In a place where darkness, distance, moving water, and cultural expectation meet, the mind becomes part of the observational environment. The mystery does not need to be invented afterward. It can begin at the exact moment an uncertain shape becomes within the observer's perception, something with a name. That transformation is subtle because perception usually feels immediate and certain. The observer does not experience a list of competing possibilities followed by a deliberate choice. Instead, an interpretation arrives as part of the experience itself, carrying apparent shape, movement, and intention with it. The boundary between observation and interpretation can therefore become difficult to notice. Technology has changed the way Loch Ness can be watched, but it has not changed the basic difficulty of knowing exactly what moves beneath its surface. In recent years, investigators have begun carrying instruments that can listen, map, photograph, and measure in places where human eyes can do very little. The result is a more detailed portrait of the loch, yet not a final answer. During the searches of 2023 and 2024, teams associated with the Loch Ness Center and Loch Ness Exploration brought several kinds of equipment together. Multi-beam sonar could construct detailed three-dimensional maps of the underwater floor, revealing contours that older surveys could only approximate. Hydrophones extended the search into another sense, recording sounds traveling through the water at different depths. From above, thermal imaging drones examined the surface for temperature patterns and moving forms, while baited underwater cameras waited below with night vision. Remotely operated vehicles added another perspective, descending beyond 91 meters, about 300 feet, into regions difficult for ordinary equipment to reach. Each instrument sees a different version of the same environment. Sonar records reflected sound, cameras record light, hydrophones capture pressure waves, thermal sensors detect differences in infrared radiation. None of these measurements is a direct translation of what an animal would look like to a person standing on the shore. A contact that appears substantial on sonar may become ambiguous when examined through another method, especially when the object is moving through layers of water with different temperatures and densities. In September of 2024, skipper Steve Sloggy reported a sonar contact that he estimated to be more than 8 meters, about 26 feet, in size. The observation was larger than a contact recorded during a survey in 2020, estimated at roughly 7.5 meters, about 25 feet. The data was submitted to Raymarine, a manufacturer of marine electronics, for independent examination. A sonar return can suggest dimensions and movement, but interpretation still depends on the shape of the echo, the surrounding water, and the behavior of the target. The following year, during the latest organized search by the Loch Ness Center, hydrophones registered unusual underwater sound signatures shortly after a baited camera trap had been lowered into the loch. No accompanying visual record established what produced the sounds. The absence of an image did not turn the recording into evidence of an animal, but neither did it provide an obvious identification. Sean McLeod, a local skipper with years of experience operating sonar-equipped vessels, has accumulated more than 200 unidentified contacts over roughly a decade. Many appeared between 24 and 40 meters, about 80 to 130 feet, near the transition between warmer and colder layers. Raymarine has reviewed some of his footage and suggested that large fish or marine mammals could account for certain anomalies. Such interpretations are important because unidentified does not automatically mean unknown species. It means that the available measurement has not yet provided enough information for a secure identification. Modern technology has therefore narrowed some possibilities while leaving other observations suspended between explanation and uncertainty. The instruments are more sensitive, the maps are more detailed, and the search can reach deeper than before. They can distinguish structure, movement, temperature, and sound with a precision unavailable to earlier investigators, while still leaving room for the ordinary limits of measurement. A dark return remains a return, a sound remains a sound, and neither becomes a species simply because the surrounding legend gives it a familiar shape. There is a particular depth in Loch Ness where two different worlds meet and where the search for an explanation becomes unusually difficult. Between roughly 24 and 40 meters, about 80 to 130 feet, the water passes through its thermocline, a boundary separating the warmer upper layer from the colder water below. This transition is not a thin, motionless line. It can rise, sink, tilt, and ripple as weather and seasonal changes reshape the water column. For living animals, such a boundary can become a useful corridor. Temperature influences metabolism, movement, and the distribution of smaller organisms, which in turn affects larger fish. European eels moving through the loch can encounter changing conditions as they cross this layer, while fish such as Arctic char may gather around depths where food and temperature overlap. When rivers swell during wetter seasons, fresh inflows carrying suspended peat and other material alter the upper water and can shift the position of the transition. Animals responding to those changes may shift with it, so the same depth does not always represent the same physical conditions. Sonar introduces another complication. Sound does not travel through every layer of water in exactly the same way. Its speed changes with temperature, pressure, and density. When a sonar pulse encounters a strong change between layers, part of its energy can bend or scatter rather than returning along the path an operator expects. The resulting echo may appear displaced, distorted, or separated from the object that produced it. Under some conditions, the boundary itself can act like an acoustic lens, redirecting sound and creating returns that resemble physical targets. That distinction matters because an unidentified contact is not the same as an unidentified animal. The instrument can establish that something reflected energy, moved, or changed position, yet the water between the source and the receiver may influence every one of those observations. The deeper the interpretation reaches, the more carefully those layers must be considered. This makes the thermocline an unusual meeting place between biology and measurement. A fish moving through the transition can produce a genuine echo while the surrounding water simultaneously alters how that echo is received. A group of fish may appear larger than its individual members. A single eel can create a moving return whose dimensions are difficult to judge from sonar alone. Even a temperature structure without any animal inside it can generate an anomaly that deserves investigation. The behavior of the water adds another layer. Internal waves can travel along the boundary beneath the surface, carrying water in directions that differ from the motion visible above. An animal following such a current may seem to move against the wind or surface drift. To an observer watching only the surface, the movement can appear deliberate and independent of the surrounding conditions. Sonar can record that movement, while still providing an imperfect picture of its cause. For Sean McLeod, the repeated appearance of unidentified contacts within this depth range is therefore scientifically interesting, without requiring a mysterious explanation. The pattern may reflect where animals naturally gather, where internal currents become active, or where acoustic conditions become complicated. It may also contain several of these effects at once. The thermocline is consequently both a biological boundary and a measurement boundary. It concentrates changing water conditions, moving organisms, and shifting currents in the same vertical region where sound itself becomes harder to interpret. Every return from that zone carries information, but the information arrives through layers that can reshape it before it reaches the instrument. In such a place, Uncertainty is not an absence of data. It is a property of the environment through which the data must travel. Loch Ness has a doorway, and it is not located on the surface. At its northern end, the River Ness carries water away from the loch toward Inverness and eventually into the Moray Firth, creating a physical connection between the freshwater basin and the sea. The river runs for roughly 11 kilometers, about 7 miles, between the loch and the coast, providing a route through which animals can move in either direction. That connection changes the biological possibilities of the loch in a subtle but important way. Freshwater does not necessarily mean isolation. Atlantic gray seals have demonstrated this themselves. These powerful marine mammals have been observed inside Loch Ness after traveling through the River Ness. A mature seal can reach about 2 meters, roughly 7 feet, in length and weigh around 250 kilograms, about 550 pounds. When one moves through dark water, with most of its body hidden below the surface, only the head, neck, and a narrow portion of the back may remain visible. From a distance, the resemblance to familiar descriptions becomes easier to understand. The rounded head rises above the water, followed by a tapering neck-like section, while the animal's body remains concealed beneath the surface. A seal does not need to resemble a legendary creature in any biological sense. The resemblance exists in the limited portion of the animal that an observer can actually see. The River Ness also offers something that an isolated lake could never provide: a route for temporary visitors. A marine animal does not need to establish a permanent population inside Loch Ness to become part of its history. It only needs to enter, remain for a period of time, and leave again. Such an animal could produce an unusual observation during a brief passage, then return toward the sea through the same connected waterways. The wider geography makes this possibility more interesting. The Caledonian Canal crosses the Great Glen and links major bodies of water through a chain of lochs and engineered waterways. Although movement through the canal system is controlled by locks and other structures, the landscape itself demonstrates that Loch Ness belongs to a connected network rather than existing as a completely closed freshwater world. Water, vessels, fish, and occasionally marine animals can cross boundaries that appear more absolute on a map than they are in nature. For a creature that visits only temporarily, the evidence it leaves behind can also be difficult to interpret. An animal passing through might shed skin cells, mucus, scales, or other biological material into the water, but the amount and persistence of environmental genetic material depend on many factors. Water movement can dilute traces, currents can transport them away from the source, and degradation can gradually remove detectable genetic fragments. The Environmental Genetic Survey, therefore, provides powerful information about the organisms present within the sampled water, but it does not function like a permanent census of every animal that has entered the loch. A transient visitor could pass through before sampling, remain outside the most concentrated sampling areas, or leave genetic material that had already degraded beyond reliable detection. This does not establish that an unknown marine animal uses the River Ness as a hidden passage. It establishes something more modest and scientifically useful. The geography allows movement, and documented seals prove that marine mammals can reach the loch. That fact removes one assumption from the mystery: the idea that anything unusual found inside Loch Ness must have originated there and remained there throughout its life. The river therefore acts as more than an outlet. It is a biological corridor, narrow compared with the vast volume of the loch, yet open enough to connect two very different environments. An animal entering through it could become part of the sighting record for a short time, then continue downstream and vanish into the wider waters beyond the loch. By this stage, the investigation has become less a search for a monster than a careful narrowing of possibilities. Decades of observation, acoustic surveys, biological sampling, and repeated expeditions have not produced a specimen, a body, or a genetic signature belonging to a previously unknown large animal. Instead, each method has gradually removed particular explanations from the landscape of possibility. The environmental genetic survey was especially important because it tested the loch without depending on an animal being seen at the surface. Its samples contained genetic traces from the organisms living in and around the water, yet no reptilian sequences appeared. There was no genetic evidence for a surviving plesiosaur, nor for Greenland sharks, Atlantic sturgeon, Wells catfish, or basking sharks. The result does not mean that every individual of those species could never pass through undetected. It means that the extensive sampling provided no evidence that these animals form part of the loch's established biological community. Physical reasoning narrows the field further. A large mammal or reptile that needed to breathe air at regular intervals would have to expose itself repeatedly, creating opportunities for observation. A substantial animal living permanently in the loch would also require energy, and energy ultimately comes from food. Loch Ness contains a real ecosystem, but its available biomass places limits on the number and size of large predators it could sustain over long periods. A hidden population of enormous animals would need an ecological foundation capable of supporting them, and no such foundation has been demonstrated. The absence of recovered remains also matters, although it must be treated carefully. Deep water, decomposition, sediment, and the immense volume of the loch can conceal biological material, so the lack of a discovered skeleton cannot by itself prove that no large animal has ever died there. What it does weaken is the idea of a long-established population leaving generations of remains behind without producing any convincing physical evidence. Sightings themselves have also become less mysterious when examined alongside the conditions surrounding them. Weather, wind, boat traffic, wave patterns, seiches, floating timber, swimming animals, and atmospheric refraction can each alter the appearance of the surface. When those factors are reconstructed against individual reports, many observations acquire ordinary explanations that were unavailable to the original witnesses. Yet the scientific picture does not become perfectly complete. Some observations remain difficult to classify, particularly reports describing movement, shape, or behavior that do not correspond neatly with any documented phenomenon. Those cases occupy a smaller territory than the legend suggests, but they cannot simply be erased because they resist interpretation. A careful investigation does not require every unexplained detail to become evidence for a hidden creature. It allows uncertainty to remain exactly where the available evidence leaves it, without enlarging that uncertainty into something the available evidence cannot support or sustain scientifically over generations within the known ecosystem of Loch Ness. This remains consistent with current scientific evidence. What remains is therefore narrower and more interesting than the original mystery. Science has strongly challenged the existence of a surviving prehistoric reptile, a hidden population of giant sharks, sturgeon, catfish, or basking sharks, and any large resident predator without an adequate ecological foundation. It has not established that every unusual observation has been correctly identified. Professor Neil Gemmell expressed the distinction with useful caution when discussing the genetic evidence. A lack of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. In Loch Ness, that principle does not preserve every possibility equally. It simply leaves room for the few explanations that have survived careful testing, while allowing the larger, more extraordinary claims to fade into the background. Ecology places a different kind of boundary around the mystery, one drawn not by cameras or sonar, but by energy. Every large animal in a closed ecosystem ultimately depends on the living material beneath it, and in Loch Ness, that foundation is surprisingly limited. The loch may appear immense from the shore, yet its cold, nutrient-poor waters support only a modest amount of biological production. The principal fish communities include Atlantic salmon, brown trout, Arctic char, and pike, along with smaller organisms that support them. Together, the fish biomass of the loch has been estimated at roughly 9,000 kilograms, about 20,000 pounds. That figure represents an entire living reservoir, shared among predators, prey, scavengers, and the many ordinary processes that keep the ecosystem functioning. It is not a pantry reserved for one enormous animal. For a creature weighing 1,000 kilograms, about 2,200 pounds, the arithmetic becomes restrictive. A predator of that size would need a substantial and continuing supply of energy simply to maintain its body. Depending on metabolism, activity, and prey quality, the demand could consume a significant fraction of the fish production available each year. A single animal might survive for a time by taking advantage of seasonal abundance, but a permanent population would require that energy to be renewed generation after generation. That distinction matters because a species cannot persist indefinitely as a solitary legend. Reproduction requires multiple individuals, and multiple individuals require enough food to support adults, young, and the wider ecosystem that sustains their prey. Even a remarkably efficient predator would still occupy a position near the top of a food chain where available energy becomes progressively smaller. The further upward an animal moves, the more biological production must exist beneath it. Cold water adds another constraint. Loch Ness remains cold through much of the year, and its low nutrient availability limits the growth of algae and other organisms at the foundation of the food web. Those microscopic producers support small aquatic animals, which support fish, which in turn support larger predators. The entire structure is connected, and removing a large amount of energy at the top would eventually be reflected lower down. A giant, warm-blooded animal would face an especially demanding calculation because maintaining a stable internal temperature requires continuous energy. A large reptile or fish would have different physiological requirements, yet size still carries a cost. Muscle, movement, growth, reproduction, and repair all require food, and no biological strategy can escape the basic accounting of energy. The ecological picture therefore places a strong limit on the idea of a hidden breeding population occupying the loch for centuries. Such animals would not merely need places to hide. They would need a persistent food web capable of sustaining their bodies, their young, and the prey populations beneath them. No evidence has revealed that kind of surplus, and decades of observation have not shown the repeated depletion of prey that a large resident predator should produce. The absence of such an ecological signal matters because a population cannot remain invisible only at the level of the surface. Its feeding would alter the community around it. Transient animals belong to a different category. An eel could enter from connected waters, remain for years, and grow without establishing a breeding population. A seal could travel inland, feed opportunistically, and leave again. Such visitors would draw upon the loch without becoming permanent residents. Ecology, therefore, does not erase every unusual possibility. Instead, it separates a temporary visitor from a self sustaining population, leaving the first biologically plausible while making the second increasingly difficult to reconcile with the living limits of Loch Ness. For more than 2 decades, one man has made the search itself into a daily way of life. In 1991, Steve Feltham left behind his home, his work, and his relationship, then settled beside Loch Ness with an unusual ambition to spend his days watching the water for the creature that had occupied so many stories. His home was a converted mobile library van, positioned near the loch. From there, the investigation became intensely personal, not because Feltham relied on a single dramatic observation, but because he accumulated thousands of ordinary moments. Morning followed evening, summer gave way to winter, and changing weather altered the surface again and again. He watched through rain, sunlight, mist, shifting reflections, and the long variations of the seasons. Few people have observed Loch Ness so consistently from one place for such an extended period. His routine also meant that he was present when conditions changed gradually, rather than appearing only when the legend was already on someone's mind. That continuity gave him an unusually long record of comparison. That duration gives his testimony a particular value. A brief sighting can be shaped by unusual conditions that disappear within minutes. Feltham had the opportunity to encounter the loch across years of changing circumstances. He saw the same stretches of water repeatedly, becoming familiar with the ordinary movements that can appear unusual when encountered only once. Eventually, his interpretation of the mystery changed. In 2018, Feltham publicly stated that he no longer believed Nessie was a surviving prehistoric reptile or an unknown giant animal. After years of direct observation and following the accumulating scientific evidence, he came to favor a much more familiar possibility: the Wells catfish. The Wells catfish is a large freshwater fish native to parts of continental Europe. Exceptional individuals can reach about 4 meters, roughly 13 feet, in length, and approach 127 kilograms, about 280 pounds, in mass. Its elongated body can move in a pronounced undulating pattern, while its broad head remains close to the surface when the animal rises. Seen briefly across dark water, those characteristics could create a shape that resembles some traditional descriptions of Nessie without requiring an unknown species. The Environmental Genetic Survey did not detect Wells' catfish sequences. That result weighs against the species being established throughout the loch, but Feltham has pointed out a limitation that applies to environmental sampling generally. The survey collected 250 samples from a vast body of water. A genetic snapshot can reveal organisms present where and when samples are taken, yet a negative result does not establish that every individual has been absent from the entire system at every other moment. This does not make the catfish explanation proven. It simply places it within the smaller group of possibilities that remain physically imaginable, while avoiding many of the larger biological problems attached to a hidden prehistoric animal. Feltham's conclusion emerged not from one spectacular encounter, but from years of seeing the loch behave as a real body of water, populated by ordinary animals and shaped by changing conditions. He continues to watch, preserving the habit that began when he first arrived. His hope has not disappeared, but it has changed form. The unknown creature of his early search has gradually given way to a more modest possibility, one grounded in an animal that already exists. After thousands of days beside Loch Ness, Feltham's conclusion is therefore striking in its restraint. The mystery may not require a lost reptile, an ancient survivor, or an undiscovered giant. It may involve something much more familiar, moving through the water briefly enough and strangely enough to become a legend. There is another force moving beneath the surface of the Nessie story, and it has nothing to do with fins, sonar, or genetics. The legend has become part of the local economy, woven into hotels, restaurants, boat tours, museums, souvenirs, guided expeditions, and the steady arrival of visitors who come hoping to glimpse the place where the story lives. Estimates have placed the annual economic contribution of Nessie close to £80 million for Scotland, drawing value from tourism, accommodation, admissions, merchandise, transport, and related spending. Hundreds of thousands of visitors are associated with the loch each year, while broader estimates place annual tourism at around 1 million people. Not every visitor arrives for the creature alone, yet the legend remains one of the most recognizable reasons that this stretch of the Highlands appears on travel itineraries from around the world. In Drumnadrochit, the mystery has acquired a physical home. The Loch Ness Center presents the history of the legend while also supporting organized searches and experiences built around the continuing investigation. Shops sell images of the creature. Boat operators carry visitors across the water, and local businesses benefit from a story that has remained unresolved for generations. Even the landscape becomes part of the attraction because the surrounding roads, viewpoints, and villages are connected in the public imagination to the possibility of seeing something unusual. Technology has added another layer. Permanent webcams now watch portions of the loch surface around the clock, allowing viewers far beyond Scotland to participate in the search. A person thousands of miles away can open a screen and observe the same water being watched by visitors standing on the shore. The cameras create an ongoing sense of presence, turning an old folklore tradition into a continuous digital experience. They also change the rhythm of expectation. Instead of a sighting belonging only to someone standing beside the water, an unexplained shape can now become a shared event, watched, discussed, replayed, and interpreted by people who have never visited Scotland. There is an interesting tension within that arrangement. The people involved are not necessarily inventing sightings or pretending to believe in something they consider false. Many are genuine believers, while others remain sincerely open to an unusual discovery. A business owner can care about scientific evidence and still recognize that the legend brings visitors through the door. A guide can explain the skeptical case and still enjoy telling the stories that made the place famous. The economic value of the mystery, therefore, does not require a conspiracy. It only requires an unresolved story that people continue to find compelling. Once thousands of livelihoods, visits, broadcasts, tours, and products become connected to that story, the mystery develops momentum of its own. A confirmed discovery could bring enormous attention for a time, but a definitive explanation could also change the character of the attraction. Uncertainty allows the story to renew itself with every unusual photograph, sonar contact, eyewitness report, or new expedition. The legend itself is far older than modern tourism, reaching back roughly 14 centuries in Scottish tradition. Its economic life is much newer, emerging as transportation improved, tourism expanded, and the creature became an international cultural symbol. What began as folklore eventually became an industry, and the industry learned to exist comfortably beside uncertainty. That does not make the sightings artificial, nor does it make every witness part of a commercial performance. It simply adds another human layer to the mystery. The creature may remain unconfirmed, yet the idea of the creature has become remarkably tangible, supporting journeys, businesses, cameras, research projects, and memories along the shores of Loch Ness. By the middle of the 2020s, the search for Nessie has become less a single investigation than a continuing habit, renewed each season by people carrying better instruments, longer memories, and the same enduring curiosity. Along the shores of Loch Ness, sonar operators, boat crews, photographers, researchers, and visitors now contribute pieces to an archive that grows without ever becoming complete. The Loch Ness Center continues to organize searches using several kinds of technology at once. Sonar sweeps beneath the boats, thermal cameras examine the surface from above, hydrophones listen through the deeper water, and baited cameras wait below for whatever might pass within their field of view. Loch Ness exploration has expanded public participation as well, allowing enthusiasts to join the observation process rather than leaving the search entirely to professional teams. Webcams extend that reach beyond Scotland, turning distant observers into part of a scattered network watching the same changing surface. The accumulating records are intriguing precisely because they resist a simple pattern. Sean McLeod has logged more than 200 unidentified sonar contacts over many years. A later contact in 2024 was considered unusually large by the person who recorded it, while acoustic signatures detected during a 2025 search added another kind of anomaly. Yet an unidentified return remains only that, without a visible animal, recovered tissue, unmistakable imagery, or independently repeatable evidence. The instrument can reveal that something interacted with the sound field without revealing exactly what produced it. Then, in May of 2025, photographs from Urquhart Bay added another small piece to the collection. A dark mass appeared beneath the surface and seemed to move through the water over several minutes during clear weather. The Loch Ness Center described the observation as particularly captivating and identified it as its first significant sighting of that year. The photographs provide something tangible to examine, but the shape itself remains unidentified. It could represent an animal, an object beneath the surface, or a distortion created by distance, water, and changing light. The image records an observation without supplying its interpretation. That distinction has become increasingly important as the search grows more sophisticated. Each new survey also leaves behind a record that can be compared with older observations, allowing patterns to emerge gradually over time rather than through one dramatic encounter. Modern equipment can measure conditions that earlier observers could only describe. It can locate a contact, preserve a photograph, record an acoustic event, and place observations within a precise sequence. Yet, improved measurement does not automatically produce certainty. In a deep freshwater environment, where visibility can become extremely limited, every instrument still has a boundary beyond which interpretation begins. Loch Ness contains roughly 7.5 cubic kilometers, about 1 8 cubic miles, of water, much of it darkened by dissolved organic material and depth. No existing search method can examine every part of that volume continuously. A large animal could remain outside a camera's field, below a sonar sweep, or simply beyond the moment when an observer happens to be watching. So, the modern search continues, without a final experiment waiting at the end of it. There is more recorded information than ever before, more observers, more instruments, and more opportunities to compare one unusual observation with another. Yet the central evidence remains unresolved. Science has narrowed many possibilities and explained many sightings, while leaving a small remainder that does not fit neatly into any single explanation. The mystery persists not because technology has failed to advance, but because even advanced technology can only describe what it manages to encounter. Long before an observation becomes a story, the human brain has already begun deciding what kind of event it might be. A shape moves across water, a ripple breaks an expected pattern, or something dark appears for a moment between changing reflections. The eyes deliver fragments, but perception assembles those fragments into an interpretation, drawing on memory, expectation, and experience. This tendency is not a flaw added to the modern mind. Pattern recognition was one of the abilities that helped human beings survive. A movement among vegetation could signal an animal. A change in another person's expression could indicate intention, and an unfamiliar sound could deserve immediate attention. In uncertain conditions, the cost of overlooking a genuine threat could be greater than the cost of noticing one that was not there. The result is a perceptual system inclined toward useful caution, especially when information arrives incomplete. That same system can become remarkably creative when confronted with an ambiguous scene. Apophenia describes the perception of meaningful patterns within unrelated or uncertain information. Faces appear in clouds, familiar forms emerge from shadows, and disconnected sounds can seem to form a coherent sequence. The brain is not simply receiving the world like a recording device. It is continuously constructing the most plausible account available from incomplete sensory material. Loch Ness offers an unusually suitable setting for that construction. Its water can become dark with dissolved organic material. Visibility may diminish rapidly with distance, and waves can separate an object from the context needed to identify it. A distant animal may appear as only a head, a line of back, or a sequence of moving shapes. A floating object can lose its ordinary scale when there is nothing nearby to provide comparison. Once an observer has learned the cultural image of a creature associated with the loch, that image becomes one of the templates available to perception. Stories, photographs, souvenirs, and conversations can strengthen that template before a person ever looks across the water. The expectation can therefore arrive at the shoreline before the observation itself. Expectation does not require dishonesty. An observer can report exactly what they remember seeing while still having experienced an interpretation rather than a complete physical description. Research into eyewitness memory, including the work of psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, has shown that recollection is reconstructive. Later information, discussion, suggestion, and repeated retelling can influence how an earlier event is remembered. A person who initially noticed an unexplained shape may eventually remember a more definite animal, not because they chose to invent one, but because memory gradually preserves meaning as well as sensation. Psychologist Bruno Bettelheim wrote about the human tendency to give form and location to otherwise undefined anxieties. A named creature occupying a particular place can become easier to think about than an uncertainty with no boundary. In this sense, the monster of Loch Ness exists on two levels at once. There is the physical question of what may have moved through the water, and there is the psychological presence created when thousands of people carry the same image into the same landscape. The long history of sightings, therefore, does not require thousands of identical encounters. It can emerge from thousands of separate moments passing through a similar perceptual system. Each observer brings different expectations, memories, distances, weather conditions, and visual limitations, yet the brain has a common habit of completing incomplete patterns. That habit is ancient, efficient, and deeply human. At Loch Ness, it meets a landscape unusually well suited to leaving parts of an observation unresolved, allowing a fleeting shape to become not merely something seen, but something given a name, a history, and a place within the imagination. A complete answer about Loch Ness would require something the lake has never offered: complete access to every part of itself at the same moment. Its depth, darkness, dissolved organic material, changing weather, and moving water place natural limits on observation. Even the most advanced survey can examine only a portion of the environment during a particular interval from particular positions. What happens outside those boundaries remains unobserved. The scale of that limitation becomes clearer when the entire volume is considered. Loch Ness contains roughly 7.5 cubic kilometers, about 1.8 cubic miles, of fresh water. Searching such a volume is fundamentally different from examining a small pond or enclosed tank. A camera records only the water within its field of view. Sonar depends on the path and behavior of sound through changing layers. An observer on shore sees only a fraction of the surface, while a boat moving across the loch leaves most of the surrounding water outside immediate observation. Even an exhaustive survey would have a temporal problem. An animal does not need to remain in one place for an investigation to miss it. A solitary eel could occupy a hidden part of the loch for years, move through deeper water during a survey, or eventually leave through the River Ness. A transient marine visitor could enter, remain briefly, and depart before researchers happen to sample the relevant water. The evidence would then become historical rather than physical, preserved in observations rather than in the animal itself. This creates an unusual relationship between observation and uncertainty. The same conditions that make distant shapes difficult to identify also make complete verification difficult. Darkness can turn a familiar animal into an unfamiliar silhouette, while depth can place the source of a sonar return beyond visual confirmation. Weather can alter the surface, reflections can reshape distant objects, and underwater layers can influence the behavior of sound. Each individual effect is ordinary physics, yet together they create a setting in which ambiguity can survive for a remarkably long time. The legend adds another layer. Once a place becomes associated with a particular creature, every unusual observation enters an existing framework of meaning. A strange wake is no longer simply a wake to everyone who encounters it. A dark form beneath the surface carries a cultural history that reaches back through generations of stories, photographs, expeditions, and personal accounts. The environment supplies uncertainty, while the legend supplies an interpretation ready to receive it. That relationship forms a self-reinforcing cycle. The loch produces unexplained observations because its physical conditions are difficult to observe completely. Those observations sustain interest, and interest brings more people to the water with cameras, sonar equipment, hydrophones, and long lenses. New searches produce additional anomalies, while the absence of definitive evidence prevents the mystery from reaching a final resolution. Each side, therefore, feeds the other without requiring deliberate invention. There is a deeper scientific distinction within this cycle. Failure to detect an animal is not automatically proof that no animal exists, but neither is an unexplained observation proof that an unknown animal does exist. Between those two statements lies the territory where the Loch Ness mystery has remained for generations. Evidence can narrow possibilities, expose weak explanations, and reveal what the ecosystem can or cannot support. Yet some uncertainty remains whenever observation is incomplete. Loch Ness, therefore, does not need to hide a monster to preserve its legend. It only needs to remain what it already is, a vast, dark, changing body of water that cannot be observed everywhere, all the time. In that environment, certainty has a boundary, and beyond that boundary, the unanswered space remains available for another observation, another interpretation, and another night beside the water. The real story of the Loch Ness Monster begins without a monster at all. It begins with a landscape whose physical character has given human imagination an unusually deep surface on which to work. Loch Ness is ancient, darkened by dissolved organic material, shaped by deep geological structures, and difficult to observe across its full depth. For centuries, those qualities have allowed the unseen world beneath the water to remain partly separate from the world above it. Deep water has always invited stories. Across human cultures, creatures have been imagined beneath oceans, rivers, and lakes. From the kraken of Norse tradition to sea serpents drawn onto old maps, the kelpies of Scottish folklore, and the leviathan described in the Book of Job. These traditions did not require evidence of a particular animal. They grew from a more fundamental human experience, the awareness that water can conceal an enormous volume of a world that the eye cannot enter. Loch Ness gave that ancient instinct a precise address. Its position within the Scottish Highlands, its long enclosed shape, and its changing weather created a setting where distant movements could acquire an unusual presence. Then came the age of newspapers, cameras, motor cars, and mass tourism. A local story could travel farther than ever before, and a fleeting observation could be transformed into an image that people thousands of miles away could examine and reinterpret. From there, the sequence became almost self-sustaining. A name gave the mystery an identity. Photographs gave it a recognizable form. Stories connected separate observations across generations. Tourism gave the legend an economic life, while organized searches turned uncertainty into a continuing scientific and cultural investigation. Each new expedition added another layer to a history that had already become much larger than any individual sighting. Science has changed what can responsibly be said about the loch. It has revealed a cold, nutrient-poor ecosystem whose productivity places strict limits on any large permanent predator. Environmental sampling has found no convincing evidence of prehistoric reptiles or other extraordinary animals. At the same time, genetic surveys have shown that unusual eels are entirely plausible inhabitants, while the River Ness provides a physical route through which marine animals can occasionally enter the freshwater system. The lake itself also resists simple observation. Its maximum depth reaches about 230 meters, about 755 feet, while its total volume is roughly 7.5 cubic kilometers, about 1.8 cubic miles. Within that immense body of water, temperature layers shift, sound bends, floating objects drift, and visibility can disappear within a short distance. The same physical conditions that make an observation memorable can make that observation difficult to verify. What remains is therefore an unusual balance. Science has found no monster, yet it has also not produced a complete explanation for every detailed and persistent account preserved through the centuries. Some observations can be traced to wildlife, weather, waves, floating timber, optical effects, or the human tendency to complete incomplete patterns. Others remain unresolved because the original information is too limited to identify with confidence. The water has not changed its essential character because the legend became famous. The deep basin remains layered, the currents continue to shape the surface, and the darkness below remains largely beyond ordinary sight. Somewhere within that volume, life continues according to the ordinary rules of biology and physics, even when the observer cannot immediately determine what produced a movement. Perhaps that is why the legend has endured. The mystery does not require a hidden creature to remain meaningful. It requires only a boundary between what can be seen and what cannot, a place where observation ends and interpretation begins. Loch Ness has provided that boundary for generations, and the human imagination has continued to meet it at the water's edge.